Batman versus Superman, Captain America versus Iron Man, me versus male pattern baldness, Jack Kirby versus John Byrne. If it's one thing that comic fans love, it's when friends turn to enemies. Welcome back to Comic Krackle. I'm your host. I get it. I too am a sucker for the dramatics, and that's why I'm here making this video. Today we're going to be looking back at the feud between Brian Michael Bendis and Robert Kirkman as a result of Kirkman releasing a call to arms for all of the comic creators at the big two, meaning Marvel and DC, to leave and go make creator-owned work. Let's jump into the Kirkman Manifesto, but first, a word from our sponsor. After 2008 San Diego Comic-Con, Robert Kirkman released an announcement stating that he'd be leaving Marvel Comics as well as moving over to Image Comics in a partner position. Basically, his focus would be exclusively on creator-owned titles. He stated that he was going to release a document basically outlining his thoughts on why he was moving over, but he decided to record a video, and this was later deemed the Kirkman Manifesto. While doing research on the topic, I was unable to scour the internet and find this mythical video where he basically has the call to arms. However, John Suntress of the Wordballoon podcast had the foresight to preserve this audio. It's going to be linked down below. Now, class, everyone say thank you, Mr. Suntress. Robert Kirkman's manifesto was 12 minutes and 30 seconds long. For the sake of time, I'll outline just some of his major points. He asserts that creators' end goal for their career is not to just work at Marvel and DC. He stated that the vast majority of creators would get their start doing creator-owned work and then graduating to Marvel and DC indefinitely. Kirkman says at this point, creators should build up their name cachet and then move over to creator-owned work. He states at independent publishers, where you're able to actually focus on creator-owned work, the creators are able to profit more because there's less overhead than working at a Marvel or DC. On top of that, they actually own their creations. Kirkman outlines that the stagnation of creators that stick at Marvel and DC will lead to a dwindling audience that's not trying to target those younger demographics that those characters were designed to target. He goes on by saying that writers who overstay their time at Marvel and DC are just fans writing to fans. And a cycle of this will lead to diminished sales as audiences won't have a jumping on point. Alongside this point, he goes into creators that are more seasoned, have more control over the stories that they're telling, and that Marvel and DC should target new talent and basically mold them to have their main demographic that they're writing to be younger audiences. He elaborates on this by stating that independent publishers like Image and Dark Horse should be telling the stories that are more adult oriented, while Marvel and DC should be focused specifically on a younger generation and getting kids into the medium of comics, but not talking down to them. Lastly, he goes on to say that creators with more autonomy over their creations will be both monetarily successful and a lot happier with their creations. The manifesto definitely got its point across by generating a lot of conversation. It ranged from multiple creators actually siding with it, along with others not receiving it so well. Basically, he's telling creators that they should make this leap of faith and going over to creator-owned work when it's not a guaranteed success, both monetarily and just if they're going to be happy doing that. Some creators just like writing for Captain America. Some creators want to tell their specific Superman story. And Kirkman is basically just telling them, grow up, you need to go focus on creator-owned. I'm not saying that, that's just the sentiment that was coming across. Infamously, Mark Waid took to his column on CBR's website and stated, "I thought the Kirkman Manifesto was just adorable. It was so cute. I remember when I had my first beer." Thank you for that biting critique, Mark. Well, Kirkman wanted to generate conversation, and he definitely did. So his next step was to move on to the previously mentioned Wordballoon podcast and do an interview with John Suntress that just expands on his ideas. He states that work for hire for the big two shouldn't be the pinnacle for one creator's career. He wanted to issue the Kirkman Manifesto to ease the hesitancy in going over and working for independent publishers by making that leap of faith. Kirkman also cites the Image founders Frank Miller and Mike Mignola as success stories that influenced the comics industry. The problem with this is that all of these creators were writers and artists in their own right. And a major flaw in his argument is just accounting for the writers and not accounting for just artists. But I'm going to get into that later. Kirkman also alludes to distribution and awareness problems within the industry, but then he says that Marvel and DC are more equipped to deal with this, and Image and other independent publishers are not responsible for it, which I kind of agree with. They're corporations, and Image and Dark Horse are basically on their own. They're independent. They don't have a studio. When John Suntress asks Kirkman about retailers that are more hesitant to purchase creator-owned works, Kirkman basically brushes it off by saying, "Hey, I'm just asking questions. I don't have all the answers. I just want to generate discussion." Okay, thanks, Robert. Kirkman also details a dwindling younger audience, but then he says that it's just his perception of being at cons, as well as talking to local comic book shop owners. Just as a side note, Kirkman is not utilizing publisher analytics on this point, and he's just realistically using his personal experience of what the demographics look like. But also, this is the writer of The Walking Dead and Invincible, so not really catering towards a younger audience. Also, it's not really taking into account that not a lot of kids are going to conventions like San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, I've never been to a single comic convention, and I'm years old. Okay, so at this point, Kirkman released his statement and then clarified, so everything should be fine, right? Okay, yeah, maybe not. Maybe I was a little bit too hopeful. Okay, so maybe there's gonna be dissenters to a poorly argued and not very well researched argument. Who would have known? Brian Michael Bendis was at the height of his powers, no pun intended, at the time in 2008, because he was basically architecting the Marvel Universe, overseeing all of the Avengers titles, as well as overseeing the Ultimate Universe within the pages of Ultimate Spider-Man. He also wasn't a slouch for creator-owned work because he was still releasing Powers with Michael Avon Oeming. So Bendis called up John Suntress and did an impromptu interview talking about his reaction to the Kirkman Manifesto and then his clarification, if we're going to call it that. Brian took issue with Kirkman basically giving an outline for how creators should act, almost acting in a role of the elder statesman of the comic industry, talking to the naive creators. He also highlights some of the problems within Kirkman's manifesto and then follow up by talking about how the majority of creators that are successful at the big two will usually keep their creator-owned work going and utilizing the corporate comics as a way to funnel that audience back to their creator-owned work. He also talks about the Image founders and specifically highlighting the time that they had moved over, that those creators were still doing work for hire. Bendis also talks about Kirkman omitting the creators that didn't go and work for the big two. And he basically says that defining this path and making it so rigid is just naive of the history. Bendis also goes on to talk about creator-owned books and saying that they're not a guaranteed success like Invincible and The Walking Dead. So when Kirkman asserts that jumping over to creator-owned, that they're going to see at least a reflection of his trajectory, is just uninformed and possibly dangerous to the the majority of those creators. A phrase that Bendis will use to ad nauseum is rarefied air, which basically talks about the status of both Bendis and Kirkman being these high-profile creators, and he says that their career trajectory is not going to be replicatable indefinitely. So that's where Bendis left it, and everybody moved on happily ever after. Oh, come on! Alright, the girls are fighting. So Kirkman and Bendis decided to take this disagreement and actually have a debate at Baltimore Comic-Con. John Suntress was supposed to be the moderator of this panel, but because of scheduling conflicts, he couldn't make it. So who did they get? So the replacement for John Suntress was Akira Yoshida. I mean, CB Cebulski. You know him, right? The now editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics that at one point used the pseudonym of Akira Yoshida to get additional work-for-hire jobs under the guise of being a Japanese man while he is palm-colored. Man, it's weird that Marvel swept that under the rug and now he's editor-in-chief. Really makes you think. Moving on. So at the panel, both of the writers wanted to reiterate and clarify just some of their positions on this disagreement. Kirkman's argument is that a lot of creators overstay their time at the big two and have this hesitancy in moving over and doing creator-owned work. He cites this and says that the stagnation is going to lead to dwindling sales at the big two and the comics industry overall, as new voices aren't incoming into the industry. He talks about the catering to an older demographic is going to be more exclusionary of younger audiences trying to start their path towards entering the comics industry. Bendis believes that creator-owned work and the success at the top two publishers is rarefied air, and stated that success for creator-owned is not guaranteed. So the hesitation that Kirkman is stating is there from creators is actually a valid point. There's no concrete way of saying that these creators will definitely get it without it being harmful in one way or another. Bendis also talks about the lack of nuance from Kirkman to be possibly damaging and irresponsible because Kirkman moved over to Image in a partner position, so his position is secure. Kirkman talks about people that are the elder statesmen of the big two basically have it made, so they don't really need to move over to creator-owned, and that's going to diminish the incoming audiences. Kirkman talks about the creators that have enough name cachet have this hesitancy and it will stifle their work at the big two. And he also talks about creators feeling this stagnation in writing for corporate characters and IP, and that a lot of these creators would be more happy to work on something that they own and they have this creative freedom. Bendis references Grant Morrison agreeing with his take by saying that they're aware that they can move over to creator-owned work. However, the security is not insured in making that jump. So painting all creators with a broad brush is not helpful. Bendis also goes on to talk about the artists that were overlooked in this entire manifesto, because you can have a generational writer work on multiple books at once, but an artist has to devote all of their time and effort into one book at a time. So having these artists make that leap of faith is a lot more difficult from an artist's perspective than saying that from a writer's perspective. Bendis also highlights that the majority of the buzz for a creator-owned title is usually picked up after the first trade is released. You have those people that are only reading in trade and don't want to make that initial attempt to try out the first issue, and they would rather try it at the trade. Bendis highlights that some of the creator-owned titles are canceled before the trade can even be published, usually within the first 3 issues. So it's pretty irresponsible to have those creators jump over with, again, blind faith in the independent comics scene. Bendis reiterates by stating that it's kind of irresponsible to make all of these creators jump over to creator-owned comics when it's not a definitive success every time. Bendis also talks about it being irresponsible to pitch the best case scenario instead of being realistic with creators. Yeah, there's a hesitancy there. However, working in tandem with both corporate comics and independent work simultaneously honestly would be better for creators. He also talks about work for hire restrictions breeding creativity, and what they can't do at their big two work, they can move that over to indie. Kirkman has the rebuttal that, yeah, creator-owned is hard, but bankable creators should make that jump from the big two over to independent publishers. Kirkman reiterated his point by stating that he's just specifically speaking about the top talent at the big two and telling them that they should make that room for young talent to come up, as well as focus on their creator-owned titles. Bendis offered the rebuttal that these top talent creators can work at Marvel or DC and then formulate an additional audience for their independent work. And at this point in the debate, Kirkman actually brought out graphs tracking a lot of his Marvel work comparatively to his Image series. Kirkman basically goes on to talk about his analytics between Marvel and independent. He outlines the sales growth between individual issues. However, he omits the trade sales, as Bendis points out. Bendis also accurately outlines the flaw in Kirkman's argument, as within the first 3 issues of The Walking Dead, there is a dip. He highlights that there's a sales decrease after issue 1, and it typically increases after the first trade is released. Kirkman then is a smartass and pulls Bendis's sales at Marvel comparatively to Powers. In the debate, Kirkman even acknowledges that the numbers that he pulled are not from the publisher, but ones that he just found online. And Bendis accurately says that these numbers are not reflective of actual sales. To counter this, Kirkman also pulls up the sales of his Image series that is stated online, as well as the publisher analytics, and says that there's not a major fluctuation between the two, but it kind of is. But the problem is he's omitting the story that trade sales are telling and doesn't have all of the accurate information if he's going to debate the analytics. So who won? Okay, so even with me being the leader of the Bendis Brigade, I'm gonna try to remain impartial. I believe that what Kirkman was stating is a very powerful thought experiment. However, he debated this incorrectly and quite flawed. As I stated earlier, the manifesto only accounts for the top writers at the big two, and he discounts all of the artists. By omitting the artists, Kirkman realistically omitted the history of the founding of Image and the wide success of independent publishers. All of the founders of Image were artists during a time where artists sold the books, not the writers. They left Marvel and DC and moved over to Image and became writers for themselves, effectively becoming writers, artists, and entrepreneurs. Kirkman also referenced Frank Miller and Mike Mignola as additional creators that shaped the industry, but both of them are writers and artists. Kirkman didn't account for the artist importance in this departure from the top publishers. At the time that this debate was started, because the market swayed from the artist selling the book to the writer selling the book. By doing so, the fatal flaw within the manifesto is this: if the writers leave, where do the artists come from? We already established that creator-owned comics are not a guaranteed success, so when artists need to decide between a steady income over at Marvel and DC or taking a huge chance and a very small possibility that their series is going to be the next Invincible, it comes down to the risk being taken by the artist and not the writer. Like I was talking about before, writers can work on multiple titles at once, but artists need to dedicate their time to one series. So in saying that, the risk is alleviated from the writers and all of it is put within the artist's decision. Other problems from the manifesto is that Kirkman is using his personal experience to inform all of his arguments. He's not pulling the publisher data and analytics to track sales and telling the whole story. He just says that he's seen less kids at conventions, so that must mean that less kids kids are reading comics. Trade sales have only become more crucial to this argument since the time of the manifesto, so realistically we need to incorporate the trade sales as well. I mean, they're not just sold at comic book stores anymore, they're sold at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, everywhere, so they factor in. Alright, so now that we handled all of the problems, what did Kirkman correctly identify? He did point out that diversification in voices is very much needed at the big two. He also did identify that there needs to be a balance between creator-owned and work-for-hire. He also did identify that creators would benefit from doing creator-owned, as they would not only monetarily be incentivized to do so, but then also they're not hamstrung by the stories that they have to tell. Realistically, there should never be a time where a creator is fully dependent on a GoFundMe for either livable wage or to pay for medical treatments, when at the same time, the creations that they made for work-for-hire jobs are being adapted for multi-million-dollar projects. William Messner Loebs and Peter David are the ones that I'm specifically highlighting in this example, but it goes all the way back to Jack Kirby. The corporations want the creators to build, but then not see the fruits of their labor in their creation. So making an effort to better the future for creators and their careers after the big two is a good idea. He also did identify that the stagnation of creators at the big two is going to decrease the new and young talent and new voices for stories that are yet to be told. All of these factors are within Bendis's statements, and I feel like they agreed more than they differed. I feel like if Kirkman provided a little bit more of the nuance and providing analytics to support his point, I don't believe that the manifesto would have been as inflammatory as it was. But what do I know? I'm just a guy writing about a debate that's 16 years post-mortem. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is a video that I've really wanted to work on because I love the small details, even if it's from spats between pals. If you like this video, go ahead and click the playlist that's going to be on the left, or subscribe to the channel and it's going to be on the right. All right, that's it for me today. Go read some comics.